Hello everybody, I'm playing some automation right now, and I'm going to talk to you guys about what kind of engine configuration you should be using in your cars. So there's four basic engine configurations that you can use for the same cylinder count. In this case, I chose 6 cylinders because it's the only cylinder count available with every single engine type. So with a 6-cylinder engine, you get 4 options. You get a 90-degree angle V6, you get a boxer 6, also known as a flat 6, although there is a slight difference between the two, it doesn't really matter. The 60-degree V6, and finally the I6 or the straight 6, as it's properly known. So, I'm sure that anyone playing this game has a vague idea of what these engines look like. Obviously, there's a difference in the crank pin angle between the 90-degree and 60-degree V6. The Boxer 6 is basically a 180-degree V6, and the straight 6 is exactly what it sounds like. So we're not going to go too into the shape of them, but more so the performance and characteristics of these engines. So, let's go take a look here. All of these engines are built on the same bore, same stroke as each other. They're all tuned to be very, very similar to each other, down to the same red line and everything. But you'll see the stats are all a little bit different on each one, and we'll go into why that is later. But for now, we're going to be talking about what they mean in not only a historical context, but in the context of which you should be putting in which type of car. So we'll start off with the straight 6. Straight 6 engines are a very old engine configuration. They were first used in the early 1900s, about 1903 I believe, and they remained popular well into the 70s, and then they kind of started to fade out of popularity. But a lot of auto manufacturers are putting them back in their cars now, because, as you see here, there's a smoothness to the straight 6 which can't be replicated with any other engine configuration. Very smooth running. They use these in lots of luxury cars. Jaguar uses them quite a bit just because of that beautiful balance. Mercedes, BMW, all major users of the straight 6 engine. Now the 60-degree V6 is not as common. It's more common nowadays, I suppose, but historically you wouldn't really see them as much. V6 engines in general started being produced around 1950 to replace the old straight 6 engines, because these could be more easily fit into a shorter hood. So, because your A-box isn't nearly as big, you can make the car smaller, you can get better fuel economy out of it. So a good example for this is the Ford Duratec engine that's produced by both Mazda and Ford cooperating together. They put those in pretty much every Ford you could think of. This is the V6, not the i4, mind you. But it's basically Ford's go-to V6 engine. I believe they use it in the Mustang, they use it in their trucks. Very, very popular. The 90-degree V6 is more conventional for American auto manufacturers historically, though, because the 90-degree V6 was made by just cutting down a full-size 90-degree V8, like a small block V8. The problem with this is that unlike a cross-plane 90-degree V8, a 90-degree V6 is not inherently balanced. That means that you either have an odd firing order, you have an odd firing angle, you're going to have a lot of vibration in it, but it was cheap for them to make. Now, automation doesn't simulate this. You can't cut down a 6-cylinder into a 4-cylinder, you can't cut down a V8 into a V6. So in general, I'd say avoid this engine type unless you're going for a more historically accurate engine. If you're going to choose a V6, I definitely would say that you should choose the 60-degree. Unless, once again, you're going for a very historically accurate vehicle. Finally, we have the Boxer 6. Now these aren't used very much. Boxer engines, flat engines in general, they're popular in Europe, but never even close to the popularity of any other engine configuration. Flat 4s get a little bit more notice, because Subaru puts them in everything. But the flat 6 is only made by 2 auto manufacturers currently, at least in production cars. That's Subaru and Porsche. Now, a good example of the flat 6 engine is obviously Subaru's EA engine, which I don't believe they manufacture anymore, but they did use it in the Subaru XT, and I believe the Subaru Alcyon and the Vortex as well, which I believe the Vortex is just a rebrand of the XT. And they also put it in the Leon and the Loyale, so it was basically their V6, because Subaru has always had a thing for flat engines, at least modern speaking. So, what are the advantages to each in terms of power? And the answer is not much. There's no real difference between them. You can see the torque value varies by about 2, with the Boxer 6 and Straight 6 having the lowest torque value and the 60-degree V6 having the highest. This could just be a product of how the different engine configurations were tuned differently, because while I tried to tune them as similarly as possible, you can't use the same exact values, because firing orders change, firing angles change, so nothing is exactly the same. So if you're wondering which to use for just performance reasons, it doesn't matter. Not one bit. You're never going to see a difference between 179 and 177 pound-feet of torque. You just won't. The higher power output on the Straight 6 was interesting to me. I believe that's just a bit of an oddity in tuning it compared to the other ones, which are all effectively V engines. What that means to me is this probably has less low-end torque, slightly, and slightly more high-end torque. But I can't say for certain, and I imagine it's just a bit of an oddity in the torque curve, so not really worth noting. Smoothness, the flat 6 is a very smooth running engine. It's quite nice actually. You can see the value of it is almost the same as the Straight 6, but not quite. The 90 degree, very, 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 very shaky. Buick in their Fireball engines back in the day, they were called shaker engines because of how much that odd firing angle would cause an enharmonic imbalance of the engine. Obviously, volume isn't going to be any different. All of these cars are using a baffled muffler and a high-flow 3-way cat converter. Same thing, emissions, it's all the same, just ever so slight differences in tuning. Weight is a big one once you get into larger engines, especially V8s. You can see the lightest engine configuration here is the 90 degree V6, interestingly enough, but the 60 is very, very close. And the reason these are lighter than the Straight 6 is because so much of the bottom end is shared by these two banks. So the engine is way shorter than it needs to be otherwise, so you get a lot more volume for your surface area. So that can make a fairly big difference. The Straight 6 is probably your go-to choice for a luxury car because of this inherent smoothness, and also because its extreme length means that it's hard to fit in a transverse configuration. So you're not going to be able to fit it to a front-wheel drive vehicle easily unless you do what Subaru used to do and mount their engine longitudinally to the front wheels only, which is a very old way of doing front-wheel drive. Volvo did it too for a while. They might still do it. Very unusual though, and it means a lot of added weight, which is why manufacturers moved to the 60 degree V6, such as the Ford Duratec engine. This is what I'd recommend that you put in your front-wheel drive sedans. Think Honda Accord, Toyota Camry. That's your go-to right there. It's beautiful, it's light, it's fairly smooth, it's just a great all-around engine. I wouldn't use the 90 degree V engine. It's wide, so it's hard to fit. It's a big square, so I guess it doesn't really matter transverse or longitudinal as long as it fits. but it will be hard to fit in a short engine bay, unlike the 60 degree, which you could fit even in a little smart car type body, any subcompact, it'll easily fit. The Boxer 6 is great actually at sports cars, because if you take a look at this compared to the inline 6, all of the weight is so much lower to the ground. And while you'll see car manufacturers talk a lot about their front to rear weight distribution, the fact is that a 50-50 weight distribution isn't necessarily ideal, but it's easy to market as ideal for people who aren't too used to that sort of thing. So, what I'd say is if you're building a sportier car, or just a car that you think will benefit from a lower center of gravity, which can make a lot of difference when cornering, or even off-roading where you don't want the car to tip over as easily, the Boxer 6 is a great choice for you. Looking then over to fuel efficiency, we see that it's all effectively the same. Now you can see the value down here. You can look as I scroll through. The only difference is that the i6 and the Boxer 6 are 0.2% lower. If you want to know if that'll impact your fuel economy, likely within a mile per gallon difference. So I wouldn't take that too much into account. What'll matter a lot more is your body style, aerodynamics, etc., as well as low friction cast pistons, which all of these are using, by the way. They're all running on premium 90 octane fuel. That's using the AKI measurement, so there's nothing particularly outstanding about that. Emissions right here, again, all the same. Sorry, this was reliability earlier. I got the icons confused, but obviously that should be roughly the same for all of them. This production units, the straight 6, is easy to produce. It just is. It's a long block with a long head, nothing fancy about it, which is why a lot of auto manufacturers wanted to use these in their cars early on. They weren't hard to make. They're easy. They did the job. It's great. And then finally there's cost. And look at how much cheaper that is. So compared to, say, the 60 degree V6, you're saving $117 per unit, and that's you buying it. So the savings passed on to the consumer about $300 per car, roughly. So you might want to consider that, but honestly, if you're running into a situation where $300 makes all the difference in your car, you probably shouldn't be using a 6-cylinder engine anyway. Now, let's go into the engines and we'll take a look at the torque curves. First, I want to look at the inline 6 engine. So, you can see this beautifully flat horsepower curve, curves absolutely stellarly downwards too. That would feel great to drive. The torque curve has these tiny little bumps, but you will not even notice those while driving. And every engine is redlining at 8200 RPM. So you can see here the low end torque isn't stellar until it hits this little bump right there. That's right where you want to be. And thankfully that's about 1500 RPM, so roughly where you're going to be at when you're taking off anyway. So I wouldn't think about that too much. Go into here, everything's direct injection per cylinder configuration. That lowers weight and increases potential output, but does cost a bit more and it costs some engineering time. It's up to you if you want to use it or not. I found it convenient in this case, so I did. Cam profile is at 30 for good fuel economy and torque at the low end, and a 55 VVL profile, because we should have these engines a little bit sporting. This is the kind of thing you'd find in like a higher trim level of a V6 sedan. High compression, because past a certain point more ignition timing isn't helping as much as more compression is. And, oh, I'm sorry, I spoke incorrectly. These aren't using low friction pistons. These are using hyper-euctic pistons, simply because the stroke was too long to have low friction cast pistons. And these engines are under very high tolerances, being only 100 RPM from causing piston stress. Next, let's look into the 60 degree V6. And you can see more of the same. There's the same bump right around 1500 RPM, another bump, and then it starts to go up quite a bit higher, faster than the straight 6. But you can see once again, beautiful horsepower curve, The VVL and camshaft configurations are pretty much perfect. They could use a bit of tuning if I was to use this in a production engine, but it's just a test bed, so it doesn't make too big a difference. You can see everything else here is just the same, and there you are. So you're not going to see a huge difference between most of these engines' torque curves because they are tuned properly, but you will see a difference in them, especially in turbocharged engines, because the V and the Boxer engines both have twin turbos, and you'll probably see a small difference if you're running at very high camshaft profiles, like in a sports car. This one, the Boxer 6, or sorry, the 90-degree V6, I should say, you can see has some differently shaped bumps. It doesn't climb nearly as steeply the torque as in the other ones. It actually drops off earlier too. So that's just a product of the fact that this doesn't fire evenly, this doesn't produce as consistent a power, but it's not the biggest deal. If you really want to do a 90-degree V6, there's nothing that should be stopping you. Just know that technically it isn't as efficient, it isn't as space efficient, it isn't as smooth. It's just not as good all around. And finally, all the pistons, all that is the same. Next, our final engine we're going to be looking at for the torque curve is the Boxer 6 engine. So, take a look over here. Everything's the same, but this torque curve is actually quite a bit more similar to the 90-degree V8 than to the 90-degree V6 versus the 60-degree V6 or the straight 6. So, fairly normal, although if you look, the top end curve here isn't exactly great. It's ideal if you have a bit more of a flat high of your power. So if we're producing 220 horsepower at 7,500 RPM, when I hit 7,700 RPM, I should be producing roughly the same power. Maybe 300 or 400 RPM in that perfect power band. And that'll just help out with your high RPM performance. But it can be hard to tune properly if you're not going for a purely sporting build. So, back here, and to summarize, I would recommend the straight 6 for a company that produces mainly rear-wheel drive or all-wheel drive vehicles. It's a great choice in trucks because of its cheapness and the fact that they do need the towing power. So that's probably your only example of when the price here could make a difference. A budget truck, like think a Chevy CK series, something like that. The V6 60-degree I recommend for most passenger car configurations because it is your middle road engine configuration, really. And the Boxer 6 I recommend for a sportier car or even an all-wheel drive setup because they are quite a bit lighter to produce with a Boxer 6 engine. The 90-degree V6 I would not recommend at all because it's just completely inferior to the 60-degree V6. Although if you are going for a V8 configuration, it should be noted that the 90-degree V8 is inherently balanced, whereas the 90-degree V6 is very rough running. So keep that in mind, and that's the reason that we don't see a lot of 60-degree V8s. We see the 90-degree V8s, the LS engines, the small block engines, all of that 90 degrees. And the only reason they made 60-degree V6, 90-degree V6 engines is because it was easy to cut down a V8. So, that right there is an overview of the different engine configurations available to you in automation. I hope you found this very informative, and ideally it helps you choose what you're going to be doing for your next car company, what kind of technologies you're going to go into. I hope that you guys enjoyed this video, and it was a pleasure making it as always. So, have a nice day.